thank you so much to everybody for like taking the time to come to our meeting, especially during the end of the semester. And this is our last educational meeting of the school year for Pad the Mitten. And we thought, you know, this would kind of be like a nice wrap up of a lot of the topics that we've talked about with period poverty and other parts of the menstrual movement. So we also we'll be talking about Planned Parenthood Generation Action and also MOASH as possible ways to get more involved with sex education. And to give an introduction to myself, even though a lot of you already know me, I am a computer engineering major with a minor in cognitive science. This is my last semester, my last few weeks of undergrad, and I'm currently the president, and Sarah will be the president next year. And I'm passionate about research. Currently, I have 2 MSU research jobs with Dr. Purcell and Dr. Millete, which focuses on neural engineering and computational psychiatry. And I'm also an MSU undergraduate research ambassador. And my favorite thing about the menstrual movement is seeing the happiness of people who receive the period products they need.
Hi, I'm Kattiah. Most of you probably don't know me because I haven't presented yet. I kind of joined this semester to have the mitten. But hi, I'm a double major in political science, pre-law, and women and gender studies with a minor in sexuality studies. I am a freshman and my Pad the Mitten positions are donation coordinator and education committee. I am passionate about educating on intersectional feminism and activism, and my favorite thing about the menstrual movement is providing those in need with menstrual products and educating about menstruation. Alrighty, so what is sex education? Nationally, there's no clear standard, and very few states have standards themselves. And so comprehensive sex education is life-saving and powerful when it's lifelong. It talks about consent and relationships, pleasure, and if it's queer inclusive, it should be positive. It talks about birth control and bodily autonomy, and it also helps to identify healthy and unhealthy relationships. It has tons of potential. Research has shown that it is directly related to the decrease in teen pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections. And there is a good chance that when teaching consent, that we can eliminate and reduce gender and sexual violence. So me and Pad the Mitten are going to talk about menstruation. Then Ginny with PPGA is going to talk about understanding your health. And then Kathleen is going to introduce MOASH, who is not here today, but we're going to talk about them anyway, and how you can advocate and do activism. And then we want to hear from you, your experiences and your questions. Okay, so menstruation in and of itself is not sexual, but it plays a role in fertility. So we first of all need better education about menstruation, because as you can see from this infographic below, I don't think many people know that even just how menstruation works. Basically, your uterus lines with stuff and then it bleeds. They don't teach that in school. Why don't they teach that in school? Nobody knows, but that's how it works. And then there's also a link between period poverty and sex ed, because we are not teaching proper sex education. We're not learning about periods. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I'm nervous. Okay, so orgasms with sex and periods. They help with period cramps along with stress, headache, backache, and mood swings. The big why is very scientific. Basically, there's a lot of different things that go on in your brain that cause different things. So there's serotonin and dopamine, which are mood enhancing neurotransmitters. So they help with your mood swings. Then there's endorphins, which are natural painkillers, and that helps with the headache and backache. And then there's noradrenaline. I don't know how to pronounce that, but I think that was right. And that basically stops the communication from your uterus to your brain, and the pain stops. So that's super cool. Alrighty, so sex and periods, what are the benefits? We just talked about the relief from cramps. It is linked to shorter periods. If you are a menstruator, you probably know you get a little bit more horny during your period. So, increased sex drive. You have that natural lubrication, and it can relieve your headache and backaches. what are the possible side effects? I mean, very obviously, there's a bit of a mess. And we also get a little bit more bloated and self-conscious during our periods. So you just need to really communicate with your partner during that time and really understand that if they don't care, you shouldn't care. And even if they care, then you should maybe get a different partner, but that's a different conversation. And sexually transmitted infections, they are, you're more likely to like get one on your period, which doesn't, I don't know why, but you are. And so definitely use a condom if you are having unprotected sex. Try to use a condom. And tampons, I was reading a bunch of articles and they were talking about how some people forget to remove the tampon before having sex. And then you might have to go to the doctor and get it surgically removed. And that just sounds like a whole mess. So just remember to take out the tampon. And then tips. Remember being open and honest with your partner. Communication is key to literally everything. So make sure, especially during your period, that you are communicating with your partner. Again, tampon removal. It just needs to be said again. Just make sure you're removing it. And then towels, washcloth, or wet wipes, just because of the mess. And a latex condom. If you know stuff about condoms, that latex ones are the best just because they don't like break as easily. I think it's latex ones. I could be wrong. Ginny's nodding, so I think that's a yes.
Latex are like one of the easiest to get. They're like really effective as long as you and your partner both don't have latex allergies. There are lots of options for people who like have latex allergies, but like if you don't, like that's like most of what you get at the drugstore is going to be like latex condoms, and then just use water-based lube and you're good.
There you go. That's good to know. I didn't know all of that information. Thank you so much, Nate. And also sex positions could be uncomfortable on your period, and also gravity is a thing. So just like be aware of what positions you're doing. That was in one article and I just felt like it needed to be said. Okay, so there's this common misconception that you can't get pregnant during your period, which I don't know where this started, but it's just not true. Especially if you have a shorter cycle. The sperm can live up to 7 days, so you can still get pregnant. You're most likely to get pregnant during your ovulation, but like you can still get pregnant during other times of your cycle. And then, okay, so preparing yourself or someone for menstruation. You need to talk early and often about it. I know for me, I started getting the talk when I was about 2 years old. My mom sat me down and we talked about the bodily autonomy, what like every part was, and then we talked about consent. And then as I got older, we talked about more things like STIs and abortion and all the things. So just start early and start often. And then answer the questions. They're going to have a lot of questions, so make sure you're prepared to answer them. Like, what is menstruation? We just talked about it. When will it happen? Between like 8 to 17 years old. How long will it last? Between like 2 to 7 or 8 days, which is a very long span, but it's very different for everyone. And does it hurt? Yes. I hate to break it to you, but it does. And what should I do? Definitely talk to your parent or your doctor, or worst case, your friend, just so that you know where to get products, how you need to like behave, because we'll get there. And will everybody know? No, everybody won't know. I promise you. You think everybody knows you're on your period, but they definitely do not. Also, again, everybody is different. Their periods are very different. How long they last, how much they hurt, what hurts. It's all different. And be positive during your talk with a person, because, you know, we want to eliminate the stigma, not contribute to it. Alrighty, so now we get into like the problematic parts of sex education and menstruation. There's this idea that women are like completely out of control and like very moody and like just shouldn't be trusted during their periods, which is just absurd, because yes, we get a little bit more emotional, but that doesn't mean that we are out of control. I don't know where this came from, but probably men. And there's also PMS. We call them symptoms, but they're more changes. We have symptoms when we're sick. We're not sick during when we're PMSing. So just changing our language is important. And again, there's no normal way to have a period. There's averages which freak people out, but I promise you, your period is most likely normal. And then there's this huge dissatisfaction with our labia and vagina appearance, which leads to many labiaplasties. They all look different, and that's so normal. I promise you, it's very, very normal. Some are big, some are small, some are long, some are short. Like, you're good, I promise. Which gets into the problematic imagery, which in textbooks they show like the teeny tiny vagina that just like is small and cute, and that's just not realistic. And they're also very white and skinny, which is again not realistic. Our bodies are very different colors and shapes and sizes, and we need to start advocating for different sizes and shapes and colors. And also, I skipped a bullet point, but the sexualization and objectification of young girls is obviously problematic because, you know, they're children. And also, it's linked to negative attitudes towards menstruation with the wish to eliminate our periods, which is problematic because our periods are important. We need them to, you know, live. So we don't want to eliminate those. So ways to improve, we need to be positive with aspects of change and growth. We're all changing, we're all growing, and it's important that we continue to do so and to not be negative about it. We need to use neutral, non-alarmist language just because, you know, changing our language is important for everything from, you know, understanding the cis heteronormative things to menstruation and sex education. Changing our language, it goes a very long way. And then with pubic hair, it's normal. If you want it, that's great. If you don't want it, that's also great. And understanding the different cultural and historical views of it. Again, using actual pictures and accurate sizes of things from vaginas to bodies, and giving alternative products to use, which I will get into right now. So there are tampons and pads, which everybody knows about. Then there's also the Diva cup or the menstrual cup. There are Glad Rags reusable pads, which we had the meeting with them last week, I believe it was. There's the menstrual disc. There's the sea sponges. I've never heard of those, but apparently they're a thing. And then there's tampons without the applicator if you're looking for something more environmentally friendly. And there's also period panties. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ginny, and she's going to talk about PPGA.
Yeah, well, like Kattiah said, my name is Ginny. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the vice president of Planned Parenthood Generation Action, and I'm super excited to be here. Like, sex ed and talking about these sort of topics that are often like glossed over or like we get misinformation on things is like so important. And like literally there's so much that I am still learning all the time, and like I do this a lot, and like I run these types of events, and like I'm still learning things. So like these conversations are so important to have. Kind of to tell you all a little bit more about me, I'm an environmental bio and zoology major. I also have a minor in STEP for environmental public policy. Like Kathleen, I'm a senior in my last semester. So this is like the last educational meeting I'm ever helping lead, which is also really weird to think about. Probably like kind of like both Kattiah and Kathleen talked about, like I'm passionate about environmental justice and the intersectionality between like the reproductive and environmental justice movements. This is sort of like I'm probably working in environmental justice after I graduate, but that doesn't mean that all of the work that I've done in like reproductive rights goes away, because all of these things are like inherently connected and are like these injustices are perpetuated by literally the same systems. So we have to tear them down in order to like make differences for anything. Then like my favorite thing about PPGA is just like creating a space for students to like learn about, discuss, and advocate for issues that like we're often told not to talk about. I really like being able to have these discussions about things that so often like, I don't know, are like portrayed as taboo. And I can't tell you the number of times like outside of like official meetings and things, I've had conversations with people about stuff like for their own pleasure, for their information, to like problem solve situations that are like not fun, that anybody wants to be in, but like we're not given the tools to like know how to advocate for ourselves, to know how to advocate for others. Like Google's fucking confusing and often alarmist, like Kattiah was just talking about. So like, I don't know, making these spaces where it's like, this is something we should talk about, because like sex and our bodies are like parts of life that like are really important, and shouldn't be something that like we're told not to talk about. And like, especially like as a woman, I've been told my entire life, like, not to talk about these types of things. And like, I don't know, that it's all stuff that like is all private and whatever, but it's like, I don't know, it's also important to have a lot of these conversations. And then, I don't know, I put my favorite movie on here because I was following what the MOASH person was also doing, which I went with The Italian Job because I absolutely love heist movies. The first Hobbit movie because I'm a fucking nerd. And then also Princess Diaries because obviously, like, iconic, shaped our generation. But yeah, sort of like building off of Kattiah was talking specifically about how like menstruation is like tied into sex ed and is something that like we often don't talk about. I'm from Planned Parenthood Generation Action, which is like a student group on campus, which is directly tied with Planned Parenthood, and we talk about like sex ed and wellness. We talk about reproductive rights and some broader like kind of gender equity issues, and we do so like advocacy and social events as well as like education. But in that like connection with Planned Parenthood, we are connected with what is the nation's largest provider of sex education. We often think of Planned Parenthood as like a healthcare provider, which is what it is like first and foremost, or we may think of like the action arm of Planned Parenthood that does advocacy and electoral work and like working with our legislators. But like Planned Parenthood is also the nation's largest provider of sex ed, and Planned Parenthood has teams of professional educators around the country who like reach over 1.5 million individuals every single year. And like most of these people are like middle and high school age students who don't have access to comprehensive or like affirming sex ed or any sex ed, because like Kattiah kind of like previewed that we have horrible sex ed standards and like basically none. And so it's like not necessarily easy for like people to get access to like accurate information and things. And then on top of like all of Planned Parenthood's teams of professional educators, there's also Generation Action chapters like PPGA on college campuses around the country, as well as youth advocacy teams in like high schools and I think even some middle schools. And like these groups lead like outreach, education, and advocacy events, campaigns, and programs for sex ed and reproductive rights issues. There's so much power in talking to your peers about these things and talking to like other students about what is just like our lives and our bodies, and being able to build those connections, and that it's not something that you have to like you don't necessarily like, there's so many ways to get access to this information, and there's so many ways that we can make it like approachable and an accessible conversation. Cool. If you want to hop to the next one, Kathleen. Yeah, so then thinking about like, why would a healthcare provider be doing sex ed? Why would like advocacy people be talking about sex ed? Just like it boils down to like sex ed is key to our reproductive rights. It's key to our bodily autonomy. It's key to just like our existence. Comprehensive affirming sex education has like incredible benefits and is even like potentially life-saving for young people. And like when we talk about comprehensive sex ed, we mean things that are medically accurate, that is shame-free, that is age-appropriate, and that is something that you're engaging with at all ages, that's culturally competent, and that's honest. So this means we're not just doing abstinence-only education, but we're actually talking about sex as something that's normal, that's positive, that can be pleasurable, as well as like part of reproduction if you want it to be. We're talking about sex in ways that isn't strictly heteronormative. We're talking about like all sorts of different kinds of sex, that sex isn't just like penis vagina penetration, but that there's so many different ways to have sex and different ways for people of all different like genders and sexes to engage in sex with each other. It's talking about like healthy and unhealthy relationships and how to navigate that process for yourself, how to have communication with your partner about like pleasure, about contraception, about like life things outside of like sex exactly too. It's giving people information about like sexuality and gender identity. It's helping people from a young age know terms that most of us aren't learning for so many years. Like, what does it mean for someone to be transgender? What is your gender and your sex, and how are they related and different? And like, what do all these words mean that we kind of just like throw around? What does it mean to question your sexuality? How do you know what your sexuality is? Like, how many quizzes did I take on private browsing tabs trying to figure out if I was straight? A lot. It would have been really helpful if someone just like talked about that process of like figuring out like, what is attraction? What is arousal? Like, I literally learned about masturbation because I read a book where the girl masturbated in middle school, and I was like, what the fuck is she doing? And then I was like, hold up, let me do some private tab Google searches. Like, why was I never taught that like people who didn't have penises could masturbate? Like, there's so many things that like go into sex ed. And then like you think about like teaching from a young age about consent is so important. We use consent in so many parts of our lives, and like we're not taught it. But giving people those terms and those language, and like teaching that bodily autonomy, and teaching like healthy and unhealthy relationships, and you think of how beneficial that is to kids at all ages. And then you think about like, what would it mean to a trans kid to learn what it means to be trans, to learn about gender dysphoria at like a young age, and thinking about like how much that might be able to combat like the mental illness and the fear and the stigma that we have around like so much of these like heteronormative patriarchal structures that like we have. And so there's only benefits to sex ed. There are not drawbacks. Like, objectively, there are not. People will say that teaching people about sex is going to make them have sex. No, people are going to have sex when they want to, when they are comfortable with it, when it is like the thing that they want to do. You are only empowering people by giving them the information about their own bodies, about the things that they're experiencing, about relationships with other people, and like that is only a good thing. And like Kattiah kind of mentioned, like having comprehensive sex ed is directly tied to lower rates of teen pregnancy, because people actually know how someone gets pregnant. They know about birth control options. They know about how to access these types of things and like what that looks like. And if you're giving them like accurate information that is affirming and positive, and like you're giving them the tools to make these decisions for themselves, to like be able to set things up in a way that's like beneficial. Like, I, as a high schooler, like didn't want to get pregnant. That was not my goal. But like, was I taught in school all of the tools that I needed in order to be able to have sex and not get pregnant? Like, was I taught, how you get pregnant, when you can get pregnant, like how that works? Also, like, what sorts of birth control options are there? How do you access them? Like, how do you navigate that with like insurance? Do you have to talk to your parents? Like, all of these different pieces that like become these questions, and starting that conversation is all like really important. So sex ed is super important for a lot of things, and it's only good. And like, people demonizing it is like sexualizing young children. It's perpetuating all these myths about sex as something that's like taboo, and something that we shouldn't talk about, and something that, like somebody said in the chat, like how masculinized sex is, and how masculized even like sex ed is. And just like all of the reasons we don't have sex ed are tied into these same structures and the same opposition to like having access to contraceptives, having access to abortion, having access to gender affirming care for transgender kids and students and individuals. Like, sex ed is part of this broader politicization of sex, of pleasure, of people's bodies that don't fit like the cis heteronormative like patriarchal structures. So all of this is like tied together, and sex ed is important and has so much potential to do so much good for everybody. So this is why we have to have conversations like this, because honestly, none of us got good sex ed. So we're still fucking learning. Amazing. So kind of like I just said, like all of us had honestly, we all had shitty sex ed. I went to what would be considered a school that had like great sex ed comparatively, and there are so many things that I didn't learn about. Did I ever learn about like non-heteronormative relationships? No. Did I ever learn about like non-cis heteronormative relationships? Oh, definitely not. We would talk about sex, and like, yeah, I had a really lucky experience where we talked about like gender identity and sexuality in affirming ways, but it was like, let's talk about sex between like a cis man and a cis woman. Oh, by the way, gay people exist and also have sex. Moving on. You're like, that was not helpful. So there's so much that like, we literally, like, none of us have had adequate sex ed. There are not national standards. There are barely state standards. In Michigan, the state standards include like very few requirements, and the requirements that they have are tied especially to like, we're required to learn about like HIV, AIDS, and STDs. You are not required to learn about anything outside of cis heteronormative relationships. And if you are taught about it, it's not required to be positive. And so there's so many things where it's like all of these different pieces, and it varies so much across the country that like sex ed is something that is going to have change at like these policy levels in order to institute these like broader systems of getting actual sex ed into schools, and not just high schools, but also middle schools and elementary schools, teaching things that are like age appropriate and helping kids to have those like empowering aspects at all ages. But then it also means that like PPGA as a group on a college campus, we do things to educate ourselves, because we recognize that like we got pretty fucking shitty sex ed, but like, I don't know, I like sex, and I want to know how to like have sex in ways that are safer, in ways that are like better and more pleasurable for me and for my partner, and for partners of like different genders and things. And so we hold events like my freshman year, we did like the sex ed that you didn't get in high school but you should have, and we brought in a sex ed educator who literally just led a sex ed class for like 2 hours and gave out prizes when we would answer questions and things. And like, I learned so much, because yeah, there's a hell of a lot of sex ed that we should have had but we didn't. And we do things like last year we held an event with Pad the Mitten where we again brought in an educator who taught us about all of the different types of birth control. There are like 18. I knew of like 5, and I thought that I was like doing good. And then I'm like, she just kept talking. I was like, oh my gosh, there are so many, and so many things I didn't know about them. Even the birth control that like I was on at the time, I like was learning about in this meeting. And thinking about like, I don't know how many steps there were, like 20 some steps to like putting on a condom. I'm like, okay, I could think of like 8. And I thought I was doing really well that I like remembered like 8. And I'm like, there are like 20. Like, there's so many different pieces of this that like, I don't know. I love having these sort of educational meetings because, yeah, we all got shitty sex ed. So it's time to try to like change things about that for ourselves. Like, it's really empowering to have the information, to know about your own body, to know about your experiences, to know about like pleasure and how to be safe for like yourself and others and all of that, that like we do a lot to try to provide those educational opportunities for like ourselves and for people who come to like our meetings and who are on campus. And then we also like connect with some of these broader efforts, which is more of like what MOASH was going to talk about like policy advocacy, because we need to legislate requirements for sex ed and to make sure that it is like accurate, affirming, consent focused, not abstinence only, and all of these different pieces that like actually make sex ed effective and like beneficial. One of the super awesome things, you can go to the next slide, Kathleen. One of the super awesome things is that like Planned Parenthood has all sorts of sex ed resources that you can access all the time. If you scan this little QR code, or I put the like tiny URL here too, I made a document that just has like a fraction of the information. But 2 of the things that like we really want to highlight are there's ROO. So ROO is the like sex ed chat bot that's run by Planned Parenthood. So you can ask ROO any question that you want. and it'll give you an answer that is like accurate. It is like all of their answers are written by like trained professional Planned Parenthood educators who like are full-time sex ed educators, and it'll connect you with more information that again is like affirming, inclusive, accurate, and it's like free. It's like it's like free to access. It's super easy to do, and like I don't know, way more helpful than ending up like 7 pages deep on some random Reddit thread of people talking about things. And like, I don't know. I love Reddit, but I don't really want to be like that as my sex ed resource. So we have better options now, like the Planned Parenthood bot. And then there's also the app run by Planned Parenthood called Spot On, which is a period and birth control tracker app. It is amazing. I use it. I absolutely love it. It is the only period tracker that I have found that like actually is meant for people who are on birth control, and like it's not going to judge you about like your reproductive goals, whether it's like to not get pregnant or to get pregnant. It has all sorts of helpful information, like a nice big button that says you like I'm on the birth control pill, and it has a nice big button that's like I missed a pill. What is that going to mean for me? Like, how does that affect things? And it's also like gender neutral. It has dinosaurs all over the place instead of like dumb, like pink flowers and unnecessarily feminized things around menstruation. So that's really awesome. And then there's just like a ton of pages that I started linking that are like some of the education resources just online from Planned Parenthood. Everything from like all the bunch of information about different types of birth control or STIs to things about like gender and sexuality, healthy relationships, consent, abortion, like all of these different pieces that like are part of sex ed and things that we should be learning about, but that it can be really hard to find information on. And it's cool if you start digging around on like the learn section of the Planned Parenthood like health center websites. They also have all sorts of resources for like parents on like how to talk to your kids about sex, types of like books that you can use to kind of facilitate those discussions, for anything that are like picture books aimed at really little kids to like books that are going to be like helpful for high schoolers that you can like give them and have as kind of like a resource in those conversations. And like for teachers, they have all sorts of videos and things to try to help supplement like how you're giving sex ed, especially because like we've been talking about like there aren't a lot of standards around it, and so it can be hard even for like teachers who are trying to provide that information to students to have like accurate affirming types of like materials to show. And then they have fun things too. Like I think I did include the sex ed like coloring and activity pages. I highly recommend them. If you have a printer, they're fun. They're good times. But yeah, that's just like a little bit about kind of like how Planned Parenthood is tied into sex ed, how PPGA is tied into it, like why, as someone who like is passionate about reproductive rights and reproductive justice, like sex ed is something that like I care a lot about and is really important for us to like engage in as like a group on campus that like is talking about and fighting for like these types of issues.
And next we're going to be discussing MOASH, and this were slides created by Shakti, and she is the advocacy director for MOASH, and MOASH stands for the Michigan Organization for Adolescent Sexual Health. And Shakti is passionate about LGBTQ plus inclusive, racially diverse, culturally competent, and evidence-based sexual and reproductive health. And her favorite thing about MOASH is getting to connect and work with an inspiring network, and their values of anti-oppression and youth, and they're youth-focused. And I forgot to delete the part about like favorite movies, so sorry that stayed in. But her favorite movie is How to Train Your Dragon series and Marvel movies, and Fast 5 through F8 of the Fast and Furious series. So what is MOASH? It stands, as I said before, the Michigan Organization on Adolescent Sexual Health. It is a nonprofit, and they mobilize youth voices, they engage community partners, they inform decision makers, and they advance sexual health identities and rights. And their main advocacy areas include access to sexual and reproductive health services, consent and gender-based discrimination, sexual orientation and gender identity, including LGBTQIA+, and expectant and parenting youth, and also sex education. Their current efforts include, their main initiative right now is to increase access to condoms, and they also are trying to remove statewide restrictions in schools, and they have this 3-bill package that recently got reintroduced to Michigan legislative, but those 3 bills include the changing language in sex ed to be medically accurate, and to also include preparation for any HIV, and also to include education about affirmative consent. And you can get involved with MOASH by signing up for their newsletter, where you can get updates, and also they'll post about job postings and any volunteer opportunities, so like professional jobs, of like getting involved with sex ed if you want that to be part of your future career. They have advocacy opportunities, where you can do work with those 3 bills that I just mentioned that they're trying to work on while they're being reintroduced. And they also have workshops, and they have conferences that you can attend, and they also have a website, and their Instagram tag is @MOASHinfo. And now we're going to have a discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to stop the recording.